the University of Illinois in 2005, and this is his third visit in ED. In his first visit, that is 11 years before, he worked on golden rice, and this is one of his papers, that's famous papers actually. And today he's going to talk about how to link crop model into real economic model. And I would like to add something here. After this seminar, if someone, Dr. Ricky is also working on coupling DSAT and horizontal. If some people are interested to know how it is working, you can contact with Dr. Ricky Robertson, and then we can organize a kind of short training program on this issue. With these few words, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ricky Robertson. I'd like to request him for his presentation. Thanks.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming. When I showed up to claim my room at the dorm, the lady asked me if I had been here before, and I said it was my third time, and she said I was no longer a guest. So I don't know if that means I'm supposed to work harder or if I miss family now. Today I'm going to talk about some stuff that we have been working on for the last few years at IRRI, and it'll look like it's all my work, but really there's a small busload of people that have been working on these things. You may recognize, depending on how many old timers we have here, you might recognize Jerry Nelson and Mark Rosgrant, who passed through here way back in antiquity or something, and one of our more recent additions, Tim Thomas, as well as a whole slew of people, like I pointed out, that too numerous to mention. So what we've been working on for the last few years is trying to find ways to incorporate, to directly incorporate climate change effects within our global economic models of agriculture, and to try to do that in-house so we don't have to depend on outside sources, which sometimes don't always give you what you need when you need it, as you may have had that experience yourself. So I will set a little context and tell you things that you already know. And things that you know better than I do. So, agriculture, of course, occurs in the great wide world, and as the climate changes, we expect there to be, the agricultural activities will be affected. And we can think of, to begin with, two major mechanisms that this could occur through. The first one is, of course, that the plants are living in a different environment. In a different environment, they will respond differently. So, for example, we might expect that there will be some higher temperatures, the plants will grow differently. There might be more water available, the plants will grow differently. Subsequent to that, producers will respond, will see those things, farmers aren't stupid, and they will change how they do things. So they may choose a new planting date, they may choose entirely different crops, and that sort of thing. And all of this, of course, is occurring within the context of consumers who are actually buying this stuff or eating this stuff. And they have preferences that change over time. They respond to prices. And so there's a lot going on here. So in order to understand the implications for this in a policy context, we need to be able to link together lots of things to get a handle on this agriculture in a changing world. So we're starting out with, the emphasis here is on climate change, but in general, this is a kind of a technology change story, but with a specific instance of how climate change will affect things. So for example, we're going to start out with various future climate scenarios that come to us from the atmospheric science people. And as the agriculture people, we're primarily concerned with the temperature and the rainfall and the sunshine. And then we scare them very badly by taking their results and trying to use them in ways that they neither anticipated nor intended. That is, we are going to run them through crop models to try to see how we have a mathematical representation of the plants, and so we want to see how the plants would respond under these different conditions. Of course, this terrifies the crop modelers because they say, oh my goodness, this is not at all the way we ever anticipated or intended to use the crop models. But we forge ahead and use the conditions under these various situations, run it through the crop model so we can see what kind of yields we could expect to see under those different conditions. Of course, agriculture occurs at a fairly fine scale, spatial scale of meters and kilometers, and economic markets occur at, we usually think of fairly broad spatial scales. So we need to model the crop growth at small regions or small levels, and then aggregate these up to appropriate levels that the economic models can deal with. So we come up with a regional productivity change, which then gets fed into the economic model, and then we can do the things that economists love and talk about prices and quantities and who's winning and who's losing and what we should do about it. So the particular model that we use is a thing called IMPACT, which is, of course, one of these fortuitous acronyms, and it is a global scale partial equilibrium model of agriculture and friends. So there are various aspects, so we'll just speak about it in very broad terms. So the IMPACT model is not a single model. It has several kind of subcomponents. The pure economics part is an economic multi-market model of various commodities that we'll get to. Then there's a water resources model, which determines things like the amount of water available for irrigation for the various different irrigated crops. Of course, to figure out how much water is available for irrigation, you need a global hydrologic model of some sort to determine how much overall water is available in those channels. This occurs, as we said, at a global scale, so it has a highly disaggregated, for this kind of model, highly disaggregated spatial setup. On the supply side, we have these things called food production units. There are 281 of these at the moment. Basically, these are countries, and if you have a large country, you split it up by major river basin regions. This is in support of the water resources part of the model. On the demand side, the demand is done at the country level, so there are 115 countries currently broken out in IMPACT, and that number is climbing every day. Now, what are the things that we're keeping track of? Well, we're keeping track of a lot of things. We're keeping track of 24 basic crops. This is your, rice, wheat, maize, tropical vegetables, and that sort of thing. One of the topics of contemporary interest is biofuels and how that affects agricultural markets and how that links agriculture and energy markets. So much of the biofuels is associated with oilseed crops. So specific to the oilseeds and biofuels kind of thing, there are 13 activities, because you take your soybeans and you crush them, and then you use the meal for one thing and you use the oil for another. We're keeping track of 6 livestock sector products at the moment. So we have a total of 43 different tradable commodities at this time. And as usual, this is a research project, so there are things being added all the time. We're working on fisheries and improving the livestock representation and all sorts of things like that. And now, of course, within even just those commodities, we have various modes of production. For the crops, there are rain-fed crops and irrigated crops, which of course have very different yield characteristics. And for the livestock, there are 8 different systems of production. For irrigated systems, of course, those are tied back to the water resources model, because if you have water available, then you get the high yield. And if you don't have water available, then there's a yield penalty on that. Livestock is tied back to the crops and to the biofuel sector on the basis of the feed markets, which contribute to the total demand for feed. So as you can see, there's a very high degree of disaggregation that is involved here, but that is essential for assessing these kinds of climate change effects and figuring out which places are going to be more greatly affected and less greatly affected. So I'm just going to give you an overview of the basic idea of how we're approaching getting the climate change effects into IMPACT, which is our economic model. This is not rocket science. Basically, we can think of climate change as altering the set of inputs available to a producer. And in particular, it's changing what I call the non-marketed inputs. That's not exactly a technical term, but if you think about agriculture occurring in the context of a location and the climate there, yes, you can buy water, but you get some of it from nature. And you can, yes, you can build a greenhouse and change the temperature, but by and large, in general, you take the temperature that God gives you, and you go from there. So the climate change is going to move around what those non-marketed input levels are that are available to you. So to assess how that's going to affect things, we choose a representative basket of the marketed inputs. So you're choosing which variety you're growing and how much nitrogen you're applying and when you're planting it, what your planting spacing is, and all this sort of thing. Then we can simulate the yield that will be available under the two different situations. In our case, a baseline climate and a future climate. And then we can get a ratio between those two that tells us, did the yield go up, did the yield go down, and by how much? And somehow we want to apply this ratio to the economic model. So to see this in a very spatial way, we are pretend growing the crop at every location that we believe is important in the world. So here's an example of rain-fed maize, and showing at each location what the yield change is like. So if the yield under both situations is approximately the same, we color it black. If it's bad, we color it red or yellow, depending on whether it went down a little bit or a lot. If it went up, it gets a blue shade. Okay, so this is for a particular crop, rain-fed system, a very particular set of future conditions. Now, I'm going to show, so this is for the CSIRO A1B, in case anyone cares. Now, the next slide is going to show you the exact same type of map, but under a different set of future conditions. And my point in doing this is to point out that you get different yield changes in different places. We don't get the same map. Duh. We should expect this, but you can see that this one shows different colors in different places. Now, we need to take these very pixel-specific, very location-specific, fine-grained data and aggregate that up to get some sort of representative regional numbers, and then find a way to use those regional changes to shift or shock the economic model. So, a few little details. The impact model is based on kind of a Cobb-Douglas theory of life. So the supply functions tell you, hey, the supply based on the output prices or the input prices are just this kind of multiplicative thing of input price effects. Okay, so you can think of behind that being some sort of implicit production function from a representative producer, which, due to the wonders of the functional form of Cobb-Douglas, you get a similar appearing production function. Now, we are trying to use these numerical crop models. And so the crop model is most analogous to a really fancy production function. So when we get these yield changes, how should we affect the economic model? Should we shift the production function and then let that filter through down to the supply function? Or do we somehow throw our hands up and say, oh, well, this is kind of representative of entire regions and stuff, so let's just move the supply function directly? I will try not to bore you too much, but there is a difference between these two. There's a simple way where you just apply the scale factor directly to the supply function. So, for example, here is my beautiful toy supply function, right? So we have a price, we have an output, and the blue is kind of the baseline. If we apply the scale function directly to the supply function, it'll move it for the same price. We get less output, so it smooshes it that way, right? Now, it turns out that if you apply the scale function to the production function as a representative producer and then figure out what the resulting supply function is, you actually get a more extreme effect. If the yield goes up, then it would push the supply function out even farther. In this case, I'm showing a yield decrease, and it decreases it even farther. However, it doesn't decrease it that much farther, even under fairly extreme sorts of elasticities. So our conclusion has been, of course, to take the easy way out, rightly or wrongly. And we have several reasons for this. We are going to apply the scale factor directly to the supply function itself, because this is simpler to implement. You just literally stretch your supply function. We don't have to reverse engineer and figure out what the appropriate elasticities are and do all these funny transformations. It's also more conservative because we're using more muted effects. We're moving the supply functions around less than maybe we could be justified in doing. And even with this kind of more conservative approach, as you will see later in the presentation, we are finding significant and interesting effects on outcomes. And so the reality that we could expect to see is probably more extreme than that. And on a practical matter, it also allows us to treat the climate change effects in the same way that we treat some other effects within impact, which means we can program it in a more consistent manner, so when we make a mistake, we can find the mistake and correct it more quickly. But ultimately, this scale factor represents something. What it represents is the additional challenge or benefit that we see to be originating strictly from climate change. Now, before we go on, this is the humility part of the presentation. This is not an easy thing, and there are many, many challenges to be overcome. Okay? So let us begin with the easiest ones, the physical challenges. In order to be able to do this, we need to know site-specific weather information, not only in the present, but 50 years from now. We need to be able to downscale it from the big spatial chunks that the crop scientists, the climate science guys use, and get it down to the scale of meters and kilometers where actual farmers grow their crops instead of at hundreds of kilometer scales. There are also biological challenges. Of course, we're hoping that crop models accurately represent how the plants behave, but there are some very specific things that are not agreed upon in this world, such as the effect of CO2 fertilization. And we can speak of data problems. Soil data. Soil is very important for growing plants, I am told. And on a global scale, we don't have very good information about what kinds of soils are where. We have ideas, but the kind of details that you really need to be able to try to simulate plant growth, it's not that great. And of course, we are at this stage completely ignoring pests, diseases, weeds, and that sort of thing. Then we get into the hard part. People. How do people respond to things? People are even harder to understand. How are people choosing their planting dates? What kind of rotations are people using? How are they choosing which varieties they're growing? And do we have any idea of what this information is? Of course not. Nutrient management, water management, how are people responding to prices? These are all things that we're trying to get little handles on, and some of this is an economic model, but some of this is completely unknown, and that's why they pay us to try to figure out. There's also issues of aggregation. How do you move from, supposing we can overcome the previous challenges, so we get these very site-specific yield projections, how do you aggregate that up to a level that can be used reasonably in an economic model? We can do stuff, but then there's some challenges such as what happens about under area expansion? Well, we think we have a vague idea of what people grow where at this time. Honestly, we don't, but we think we do. We have no idea in the future. So we're going to add 200 hectares of beans somewhere. Well, where in that giant region? And what sorts of geographic resolution are appropriate and necessary? There are all sorts of issues here that we have to refine, and as we do so, our confidence will increase, but we should still remain humble about the limitations. So on to process-based crop modeling. I must confess, I am not actually a crop modeler. I just end up doing a lot of it. the idea behind a crop model, a process-based crop simulation model, is to try to take a set of circumstances and determine what the final yield would be from the plant, but do it by building it up over a series of steps. Now, of course, if you have that input data and you have that output data, the economists come along and say, "Oh, we should just throw it into a regression," and that can work. And that's called a statistically based crop model. A process-based one tries to mimic as many internal processes of the plant as is reasonable. So it actually says, "Oh, well, I have little roots growing, and it's extracting water out of the soil. So this is how much water is in the soil. And I have leaves that are sticking out, and this is how much sunshine it's absorbing, and this is how much water is moving through the plant." And so it tries to represent as many aspects as is reasonable or as possible, given your funding, to represent the plant. So you, hopefully my little diagram conveys that we are stepping through time, and we have some conditions at day number 1, and we see what the plant does, and then you move to the next day, and you see what the weather is, and you see how it grows, and how much is in the plant, and how much is in the roots, and how much is in the seeds, and that sort of thing. At this time, we are using the moving target, about 5 or 6 or 7 different crop models. We are doing rice, wheat, maize, soybeans, and peanuts. We are in the process of working with you wonderful folks to switch to using the IRRI rice model, because it is thought to be superior to the series rice model. We are also adding sorghum and potatoes. That's the one. Potatoes to the mix of crops. Do they also have a cassava? And cassava. Yes, we're trying to get cassava as well. So the idea is to have as many of these crops as possible to inform the economic model. Now, as you may recall, we had many crops and many regions, and so how do we come up with each parameter for each region to represent that climate change effect? Again, not rocket science, but it has to be done. It's more kind of accounting. The first thing you have to do is you have to choose what region you're interested in. So I'm from Illinois, so I'm going to show you corn in Illinois. So we pick the region. This is FPU number 134, the United States Pure Mississippi River Basin. And so you chop out that little piece of the world. And then we have, of course, we have a yield map. And we have a map that says how much area we believe to be dedicated to that crop at each location. Okay? So for each little dot on the map, I can take the yield times area. Of course, yield times area is hopefully production. And so that gives me how much production is occurring in each box on the map. Of course, then we can add up all of those, and we can figure out how much total production there is. And we can add up all of the area and figure out how much area is contributing to that. Of course, we just take the ratio of production over total area gives us an area weighted average yield. And so this has to be done many times, of course. But that's the basic idea of how we get what the baseline yield is, what the alternate situation yield is. From that, of course, we get the climate change shifters. Okay, but that's fairly boring. What actually comes out of the economic model is where the fun part begins. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what sorts of results that we've gotten out of the impact model as a result of being able to plug in these different climate change scenarios and what it means. So the first thing we have learned is that the prices of important commodities are anticipated to rise more under climate change than they would have otherwise. Okay, so this is the rice price under several different scenarios that I'll try to explain. The first one is here's the kind of starting point, estimated price in the model for rice in 2010. Okay. At the far right over here, we have this dotted line box, which is, suppose there's no climate change. So there's no climate change shifters. All we have changing are, general trends in productivity and area and GDP growth and preference changes, and so just all the usual sorts of, there's going to be more people in the world, more people like to eat, and what kinds of things they like to eat. So of course what we see is that the prices go up. We have three different kind of demographic scenarios. We have a kind of what we think is the middle of the line, and then kind of some optimistic where you try to shift everything in a way that should make people better off, and a pessimistic version, which is high population and low income growth and this sort of thing. So the first thing to note is that obviously the prices respond to that demographic set of assumptions, and that the prices in general are going up. So the first thing to note is, well, we have a challenge, period. Even without climate change, prices are going up, and so if we want people to be able to eat and eat cheaply, we have work to do. Now, we have 4 different climate change scenarios, which are 2 different models and 2 different scenarios, so however you like to compare them. But the thing to notice are 2 things. One is these prices here are higher than, of course, both the baseline and the beginning of the baseline, as well as the end of a baseline scenario. So climate change is making the prices even higher than they would have been. Okay, the other interesting thing to notice is that these, even though these are very different, remember how I showed you those yield change maps? You're getting very different yield changes in very different locations, and that's true across all the crops. We are still getting these price levels. All of these, gray bars are about the same height, and all the yellow bars are about the same height. So even though we have very different climate change happening in different places, we're ending up with very similar economic outcomes in the sense of world price for stuff. Now, why is it that even though we have very different scenarios coming in, we get the same prices coming out? Well, this is no surprise, a little thing we call the adaptive abilities of world trade. Okay, so of course trade, I'm not actually a trade economist, but I'm clever enough to know that trade is a pain to analyze, so you have to draw a little fence somewhere that locks something in, and you watch how much stuff is moving, flux across the fence, if you will. So this is putting a fence around all the developed countries and asking what is the change in trade flow if we look at the way the trade flows were at the beginning of the simulation period, about 2010, and compare that to the end of our simulation period, which is 2050. So where we can start is looking at this perfect mitigation case, basically saying, there's no climate change. If there's no climate change, you get a little change in trade flow for the baseline case, and pessimistic and optimistic. We're getting a little bit of trade flow change, but not that much. When you look at these climate change cases, you can see that there are big changes in the trade flows, and it's different across which kind of future climate you're looking at. So, these MIRROC model trade flows seem to be changing quite a bit. The CSIRO induces some, a more muted change, but the point is you're seeing very, very different trade flows than you did at the end of at the mid-century than at the beginning. Unsurprisingly, we can also show that various measures of vulnerability also are not encouraging as a result of climate change. So one of the kind of post-processing things that we can get out of the impact model is to get an estimate of the fraction of malnourished children. So this is a kind of a regression-based sort of thing where someone has investigated these things in the past. We can get all the inputs to that out of our model, so we can feed that through the regression and get a notion of the fraction of malnourished children. And what we can see is that if we compare the future level to in 2050 under some of the climate change scenarios versus the no climate change perfect mitigation, it goes up. And it goes up to the tune of about, 8 or 9% in the developing world. And that's, to me, not encouraging. It basically means that it's undoing some of the work that hopefully will get done in the next 40 years is going to get undone by the effects of climate change. So what would we need to do in order to reverse that? Well, that's the joy of having a quantitative model. We can say, hey, let's change some of these inputs on the economic side of, say, let's do some various kinds of investment and this sort of thing and see how that would change those malnourishment rates, and we can just keep cranking it up until we bring those malnourishment rates back down to where they would have been. So if we do that for just Asia, and we say we want to pull those childhood malnutrition levels back down to where they would have been under a no climate change kind of setup, we need to do several things. One is, of course, we have to have general good development policies. This has to continue, and we're going to have to improve. How much are we going to have to improve on current trends? That's what we're going to figure out from the model. So in addition to everything that would have happened anyway, so that's the thing you have to bear in mind. And you have to keep doing what we would have been doing anyway and do something else on top of that. How much more? Well, we'd have to invest in agricultural research, rural roads, irrigation. That's one channel that the model can accommodate. We'd have to invest about $3 to $3.8 billion per year, somewhere in that neighborhood, per year, every year, from now until then. We'd also have to invest in clean water and education. That's another channel that feeds into this, that feeds into the childhood malnutrition mechanism. That would require another $1.2 billion per year. So if you put all that together, you say, hey, we need somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 to $5 billion of additional investment every year, not one time, every year going into the future, and that would allow us, we think, to pull those malnutrition rates down to where they would have been without climate change. So to counteract the effect of climate change on childhood malnutrition will cost us $4 to $5 billion a year in Asia. So that's the kind of thing we can do with this sort of model. And so we are continuing to work on this to try to refine how all these processes to get them to more accurately represent how people behave in the real world. On the basis of these models, we understand that climate change will likely exacerbate discouraging trends. The crop models give us a way to quantify some of these effects and give us some rich detail that we can use. So, for example, the project that I'm actually here working on is this thing called Global Futures, where we're saying, hey, what would happen if we developed certain kinds of technologies? What would the impact be? Well, if we can generate this virtual crop in the crop model, then we can feed those effects into the economic model, and we can quantify some of these effects and say, oh, well, if we had drought-tolerant rice, we could decrease the number of malnourished children in this region by, 7,000 people or something. And this combination of models where we can have the biophysical models along with the economic models can allow us to quantify some of these costs and benefits of adaptation that can come from these different areas. And that's all I have to say.
Right on time.
With no clock.
You like it?
So I guess I can entertain questions.
Sure.
Not any hard ones, please.
No, not any hard one.
Any question?
I said no hard questions.
Very hard.
Your seminar is really very interesting. I would like to ask, do you consider the policy implication, particularly in the change in price, when there's climate change and no climate change? The policies imposed or implemented by rice-producing countries, and how it affects price.
Like, can you give me an example, such as like a trade
Yeah,
barrier?
say for instance, in the Philippines, they control rice. Even in importing and exporting countries, they try to have domestic policies that affect directly world price.
Yeah.
Did you consider that?
So first, let me say that is outside my direct area of expertise and action on this. However, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is characterizing those policies is, of course, sometimes a little difficult to translate what is thought to be happening in the real world into something that can fit into the model framework. And the biggest challenge is trying to predict what the politicians 10 years from now are going to do, right? And so, but yes, that. My understanding is those sorts of things are represented in the model, hopefully well, but I don't know the details.
Just because it's really hard to imagine the effect on price of climate change unless you really show a very big change in production due to climate change. But until now, several studies, even experimental studies, doesn't show yet a very big effect of climate change on productivity. There are some effects, but not so big to affect the total, say, world rice production.
Yeah, and that when you look at the crop modeling results, the crop models will show that, oh, in 40 years, we expect there to be a fairly significant change, like, 5 or 10%. To me, that means, I don't know the greater context, but, 5 or 10% yield hit doesn't sound like fun if I was a farmer. However, it's also occurring over a 40-year time span. So when you annualize those yield changes, you're getting, a 1.1% or 0.5% decline a year. Well, that's, it's going to be hard to see that over short time periods because there's so many other things that affect the variability, right? So it is not surprising to me that we haven't seen major unequivocal effects on crop productivity due to climate change up to now. There's some evidence there's been some little bit here and there kind of thing, but like you say, it's not like someone's hitting you over the head with a hammer. So the prices and the quantity aren't going to move around a huge amount, but you will also see more of these effects farther out in time because for a crop like if you think of something like wheat can actually stand to benefit from climate change because it's typically grown in a lot of, I don't want to be insulting, but marginal areas, right? Because if you really have a good piece of land, you're growing maize, you're growing sugarcane, you're growing rice, right? And so wheat is grown, say, in these kind of northern boreal regions. Well, climate change actually helps those because it gets a little bit warmer, maybe a little bit wetter, and so it helps. But with a thing like rice, it's grown in a typically very hot environment to begin with. So where are you going to see the effects? Only in places that are really hot and then get too hot. If you're in a place that's reasonably hot, well, if it gets a little bit hotter, it won't be quite as good, but you can still get away with it. So it's kind of tricky because different places will have different effects, and that's why we try to do this very site-specific global assessment, because it's not super simple and straightforward, as you pointed out.
Yes, Ricky, thank you for the presentations. Very simple, but you got your message across. My questions, I have two questions. One, in the beginning you said that farmers are not stupid. Okay, didn't you say that?
I asserted that.
Yes,
Baseless
yes.
assertion.
Yes, and you said that they will change the planting. They will do stuff to mitigate the adverse effect of the climate change. But in the scenario, you have assumed farmers are stupid again.
I have assumed
Yes.
that they are partially stupid. We
Partially.
actually okay. So now we get into the very difficult thing. So we have the most obvious adaptive measure that everyone always tells you as soon as you get up and try to talk about. Everyone's going to shift planting dates. We have accommodated shifting planting dates in this analysis. So at that basic level. Now, when you start getting beyond some of those very simple things like, oh, we'll move the planting date, it starts getting really complicated. So, for example, think about production in any kind of agricultural production in Africa. Africa, my understanding is typified by very low inputs, right? And so when I visited my friends in Africa, I talked to the farmers, and they use no inputs at all. There's no fertilizer. It's maybe you carry the manure back to the field and you put it on and you're out there with your hoe doing some weeding, but that's it, period. So what is the climate change effect on a very low input system in Africa? Well, it turns out, embarrassingly, it can actually help some of them. The mechanism isn't entirely clear, but it's probably something along the lines of, well, when it's warmer, there's more moisture in the air, and if some of that comes down over the land instead of the ocean, if you're in a highly constrained system, well, that's enough to help you out. And so actually, climate change could help sub-Saharan subsistence farmers. Oh my goodness, stop the presses. Everyone gets horrified because we all know that sub-Saharan Africa is just going to get obliterated by climate change. Well, what happened when you crank up the inputs, you suddenly realize that, oh, well, if they were putting on 150 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen, their yields would suddenly, instead of going up by 3%, would go down by 15%. Oh, that's what everyone's used to hearing. So now the question is, what is the proper comparison to make? Are we supposed to compare a low input system under the baseline climate with a high input system under the future climate? Well, then that'll show massive yield increases, not because of the climate, but because of the input. And so trying to figure out how to represent this is not very straightforward. At the, if you think you have four different points, high and low input system and the two climates, you have 4 different points you can compare, and about 5 of the possible 6 comparisons you can make have meaning in some sense. What we have chosen to do is say, well, I want a pure climate change effect of some kind, and so we're sticking with the baseline basket of inputs and applying that in 2 places, or 2 points in time. Is that perfect? No, we haven't figured out a better way to do it, and people always ask questions but never give answers.
My second question, how did you get these figures, that investment figures?
I got them from someone else who actually did the real work.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes.
I'm glad that you mentioned that you did not estimate the effects on people, and we know that due to climate change, the people who are affected by the consequences of extreme climate variability. Now, if you are going to include that in your model, what kind of variables do you like to collect?
So could you
people,
put,
social or
as in like
as variables,
like as in like kind of health outcomes sort of thing, or
because you only use malnutrition as a measure of vulnerability. So, can you suggest other measures of vulnerability that you can include in your model?
So first of all, the measure of the childhood malnutrition is an output of the model rather than input, just so that we're clear. And second of all, it is a derived output rather than a direct output. So impact is a very economic-y model, a very quantitatively economic-y model, and a very broad one. So it only considers quantities and not quality, for example. So that makes it a little bit difficult to get down to some of these more grassroots level sorts of things. So we can get out things like calorie availability and some things like that, but the one that we've settled on because of its kind of simplicity of presentation is this childhood malnutrition measure. Again, I'm going to have to plead ignorance that that's not my area. I'm here to work with Tao, So
I just like to inform you that we are doing a study on that, using quantitative and quantitative, but not exactly very sophisticated.
And so we would appreciate
So
any.
we're doing a study on how the members of the farming household and the women respond to climate change, because the effects of the productivity has, they have different effects on people.
Yeah.
So that's just like your point. We do that umbrella of the risk front.
And we would appreciate any guidance or lessons learned or advice that you could send us. I won't go so far as to say that we, IFPRI, try to be friendly with IRRI, but I personally and those I work with try to make friends. I think there's been some bad blood in the past, but we're trying to become friendly and work together.
Okay.
Oh, let's disallow him. Next question.
Not too hard. Okay. Thank you for the great presentation. And in your presentations, I didn't see any considerations about the land use change because of the climate change and also the economic development. So how are you going to, do you need to include that kind of factor into the impact model, or how do you going to present it in the model?
So I will answer this question in the same way I've answered all the questions. We do it a little bit, and we are continuing to do research, and we will do more. So the short answer is there is some effect of land that goes out of production and land that comes into production. It's tricky going into the future, trying to decide which places are suddenly going to now become available for production and what the intensity is going to be. So we're taking a fairly, shall we say, agnostic view at this point, or maybe ostrich with our head in the sand view of saying, of computing the yield changes over only areas that are currently cultivated. Okay. Now, we are also in the process of developing a land use system to run alongside and interact with impact to try to do a spatial interpretation of where the crops are likely to be grown, where the forest is, where the grassland is in the desert, and that sort of thing. And so I will be better able to answer that question hopefully in about a year or so. The longer, now I'm going to speak more from my personal opinion rather than representing the official IRRI position, not that there is one. I am originally actually a land use person, and so I guess I probably have some unorthodox views on the issue, but I'm not really worried about urbanization removing agricultural land from availability, or agricultural land from arable land, because the world's a very big place, and cities by definition are small places, and so you can double the size of the cities, and that's like, you know, 0.25% of the agricultural land. So I'm not terribly worried about that. And also when I played around with just like with the crop models of saying, okay, let's try to grow stuff right on the kind of the frontiers of production, the geographic frontiers, which then correspond to, you know, the climatic and soil frontiers of where it's useful to grow things, and then grow it under the alternate conditions. Honestly, I haven't really seen a massive expansion of area available, because if you're talking about the tropics, the only place you have to go is up the mountains, right? So sure, you can go up the mountains a little bit, but the mountains are only so big. And everywhere out and in the southern hemisphere, there's not really much to go because you have the ocean. So the only place you can really expand is kind of like the Siberia, Northern Europe, Canada thing. And honestly, it doesn't move that far, and you're not getting great yields up there, and you're a long ways from a market. And so, you know, me personally, I just don't see it happening. Now, the Republicans back in the United States will first tell you that there's no climate change, and second, that even if it happens, that there's no problem because we'll just all start moving to Canada and grow corn up there. Yeah, sorry, ain't gonna happen. So, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's okay. So some days the rice will grow in Canada, right?
Yeah, I think we have a little thing called photoperiod problems and total shortwave radiation incidents and that sort of thing. It's just, you're not going to be triple cropping in Yellowknife anytime soon. In the back.
Just a quick question. Are you solving for prices in each of the countries, and what is your world reference price for the impact?
So impact works on the solution principle is to clear world markets with a single world price for each commodity, and then there are border measures. In response to the very first question, there's a, again, not my area, is it called a price transmission mechanism? Anyway, there's a way that the world price gets converted into a domestic price and a producer price and a consumer price, and so there are various little price wedges that go in there to represent some of the trade policy and border measures. So there's a world market clearing price that's the world price, but then within each of the countries, they can each have a different price as long as it's properly related through those little channels. Does that make sense?
And how will that investment go to the pool?
How will it what?
The investment every year, the $1 billion every year, will go to the poor people.
Now we're stepping away from what I understand. There is a mechanism inside the impact model that represents the investment trends in the agricultural sector and how that investment has been I guess, historically related to the improvements in yield and whatnot. So there is some little lever you can pull that says I'm going to increase investment or decrease investment from whatever the kind of starting point is. And so they're moving that lever up and down. I don't know the details of how well it's represented, whether it's just a, oh, look, we have a little function that relates, you know, if you put in an extra $1 billion, you get an extra 3% production boost or what. I actually don't know.
Thank you for the seminar. You are such a good speaker. And you answer the questions, if not perfectly well, but you know, in a very humorous way. For the national entertainment. My question is actually already partially answered because you already touched on the distribution of like benefits or you know, penalties due to climate change. I just wonder if your model or your future work would also include looking at the regions that will be penalized more because of the climate change, and maybe countries or regions that will more or less benefit, you know, and then the implications also on the crop distribution, like what you said, that maybe you could plant rice or potatoes in Canada, something like that. And with that, what would be the implications also in terms of future investments by country or by region? I'm more interested in that because the global figure is quite, you know, fuzzy or a little bit vague for me. Yeah. So, in fact, I would like to hear, you know, the implications to the Philippines if you have looked at that, or the regions that are predominantly planted for rice.
Yeah. So I personally have not done the Philippines per se recently, but we have. So this is the evangelism talk, saying, "Oh, look, we have this giant global model. We can do this. This is amazing. Look at us, yay!" But what we have used, we have actually done quite a bit of starting with this global model. But yes, we have this high level of disaggregation. And so we have done a lot of country study kind of things where we pull out a certain country because someone asked for it, you know, with ADB or a particular government says, hey, can you help us out, give us some country level implications for us. And so, we do that. I've actually been working with some guys from a different division who do CGE style models. And so they run the CGE model, and then they use the impact results as kind of boundary conditions for the world prices, and then they look at what happens inside the country. So this is in like Syria and Tunisia and Yemen and these kind of really revolutionary kinds of places. And so then we would redo the crop modeling results at a finer scale and stuff. And so we have, yes, we are doing country level, using it at a country level either directly or as a way to inform even more detailed models. So that is definitely something we're doing.
Any more question? Anyone last minute question? No? So thank you very much for giving the excellent presentation. For the ACT staff, I would like to request our ACT staff to stay here, and outside there is small snacks for you, just you can join this. ACT staff, please stay here.
Just a 1 minute announcement for this afternoon. So before we have our ribbon cutting at 2 o'clock, the ribbon cutting will be at 2 o'clock. But at 1:50, can we all gather in